What if I told you that the best way to spark creativity, to get into flow, to actually follow through on things was to add a few rules? I know, it sounds incredibly counterintuitive. How on earth could the use of constraining rules possibly help with creativity? I mean, the word constraint itself just makes me think of limits and restrictions and just shutting down ideas. So how could that help with creativity? Well, what I want to offer today is that some of the most innovative breakthroughs, some of the most effective problem solving actually happened because of constraint, not in spite of it. And that's what we're going to talk about today on episode 301 of the I'm Busy Being Awesome podcast. Because the truth is, constraint isn't about restriction. It's about providing direction. And when we learn how to use it intentionally, it becomes one of our most powerful tools. So let's talk about it. How can we effectively use constraint in a way that supports our ADHD brains? Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. How are you? Are you ready to start applying some constraint in your life? As I just said that out loud, how terrible does that sound? In case you missed last week's episode 300, we talked all about constraint, and we explored how constraint can really fuel creativity and sharpen our focus and help us get things done more effectively. But if you're like me, you may have had some resistance pop up when you were listening. Your brain might have been saying, but gosh, constraint, I don't want to be boxed in. What if I get bored? What if I try and do it and it doesn't work? I mean, I've tried before and it never has. And if any of that sounds familiar when you think about adding constraint or creating a schedule or choosing specific days you'll work on things, this episode is for you. Because today we're talking all about tactics. We're exploring how we can work with constraint in an effective way for the ADHD brain so that it actually feels supportive for you. We're going to break down the most common ADHD resistance points to constraint so that way, when they start showing up, we can recognize them, we can work with them, and then we're going to talk about some strategies to make constraint work for you in a way that does feel supportive, not restrictive. You ready? Let's do this. So first up, let's talk about why ADHD brains tend to push back against constraint. I mean, if constraint is so wonderful, if it's so powerful, why don't we all just use it naturally? Again, a lot of us ADHD brains, myself included, often have kind of this knee-jerk resistance against any type of constraint or limitation. And so before we work with it, before we start figuring out how to bring in supportive constraints, we first need to name some of the reasons why we have this resistance. So I'm going to talk through 5 of the most common reasons why a lot of our ADHD brains resist constraint for good reason. Okay, they tend to show up, why they tend to show up, and how we can start recognizing them in ourselves, why these resistance points are here, and then we can decide intentionally whether we want to keep them or not. Because as we'll talk about later in this episode, there are times when we want to maintain a much looser level of structure and we don't want to have any constraint whatsoever. And there are other times where it could be useful. Okay, so let's first talk about these 5 key areas where the resistance to constraint comes up most often. And the first area is a fear of losing our freedom. Okay, so this is one of the biggest resistance points that I hear time and time again. It's this belief that if we use some sort of schedule or we decide on specific times or a specific day we're going to work on something, we believe that it's going to box us in and take away our flexibility and our freedom. So if you've ever thought, well, I don't want to feel stuck, I don't want to feel trapped in this schedule or this routine, this is that fear showing up. So it can happen when we think about a new routine. We don't want to make it specific because we don't want it to be restrictive. Or maybe we resist setting clear work hours or choosing specific days we're going to do things because we want more flexibility. But also on the other side, sometimes we leave it open and flexible and it leaves us working all the time. As a more specific example, it might show up when we map out tomorrow's workday and we avoid deciding on the specific tasks we want to work on because the brain thinks, well, what if I just don't feel like working on that tomorrow? Or what if I just can't get motivated enough to begin? Now, like I said, there are many legit reasons why we resist the structure, why we resist that sense of constraint. Okay, so if your approach is working for you, if you find that leaving the day open and just looking at the to-do list and going, I'm going to choose the thing that feels most accessible to me today, if that's working for you, incredible. Okay. As I say time and time again on this podcast to all of my clients, as you know, we all have different preferred levels of structure. So if your brain really thrives with that looser level of structure, amazing. You do you. Do not add any additional structure if you don't need it. Okay. Now, what I do know after working with hundreds of ADHD brains is that many of us are potentially having that harder time with doing the things. And we're experiencing this push-pull where we do crave a little bit more structure, but we also resist it because we think that if we bring in some structure, it means we have to tightly time block every 30 minutes and never do anything different. And everything has to be very strict and rigid and consistent all the time. But there's so much gray in between no plan and a very rigid plan. There's so much space to play to find what feels good for you. So if you are in that push-pull and you want a little more structure, but you're also resisting it, I invite you to gently remind your brain that constraint is not inherently about taking away your flexibility or your freedom. And in fact, on the flip side, it can be all about freeing your mental energy. By creating some constraint, by choosing a few things ahead of time, you actually remove the need to make decisions that drain us in the moment. Instead of asking yourself when you sit down for the day, okay, well, here's my long list, what should I work on? And then continue asking yourself that 100 times throughout the day, constraint gives us a framework. It gives us clear direction. And that framework creates more time, more energy for what matters most, whether that is the focused work you want to do, or more space for creative thinking, or actual rest and downtime, or hanging out with your friends, whatever it is. So for those of you who are in that dance between wanting some structure, but you're resisting it because your brain's like, oh, it's too constricting, it's going to take away all my flexibility, perhaps consider how constraint is not actually a cage keeping you in, but rather it's a shortcut to having more flexibility, more freedom, because you don't have to use so much energy making decisions about what you're going to do in the moment. Instead, you can use that energy to do the thing and then have more space on the other side. The second area where we tend to have a lot of resistance is a fear of missing out, whether it's FOMO on ideas or opportunities. The fear of missing out is a very real thing. If you have ever thought, but if I just choose one thing, if I only focus on this one project or this one offer or this one thing for work, I'm going to miss out on everything else. Okay? That's where this fear lives. So this could show up if you, let's say you're a business owner and you're struggling to niche down into one specific area of business because you have so many ideas and you don't want to close the door on any of them or block out any potential customers because they're not in your specific niche. Or it could look like starting multiple projects at once, but then have a hard time finishing any of them because it's hard to let go of the excitement of new ideas. So we just keep adding more and more ideas because we don't want to miss out on not doing them, but then we never do them all the way through. Okay? The key component here is constraint does not mean that we have to say no forever. When we lean into constraint, it means that we're choosing where we want to put our energy right now. So that way you have the capacity to finish the thing, to see it through. And then the best part is that those ideas, those other ideas that come into mind, they're not going anywhere. We can park them safely in your notebook or your brilliant ideas list. I have a whole podcast episode on that. And then we can return to those ideas next as your next focused area. Because let's be real, when we try and do everything at once, it usually means we don't finish anything. And let me tell you, speaking from personal experience, I have found that in the long run, when I realize I haven't finished anything that seemed really important to me, and I have to deal with all that mental chatter that my brain will have to say about it, that feels way worse than having to tell myself in the moment, we're not going to do that yet on one particular idea. We're going to focus on that next. We're going to stick with this thing here. When I have to tell myself no, while it doesn't feel good in the short term, it feels so much worse in the long term when I look at that long pile of unfinished things just kind of trailed behind me because I kept jumping from one new idea to the next. The third reason why a lot of us tend to resist constraint and scheduling and specificity is our brain's need for novelty. And we worry that we're going to get really bored with the thing we chose. So this type of resistance often sounds like, well, if I do the same thing at the same time every week, I'm just going to get bored. I'm not going to stick with it anymore. Or if I do batch work, if I batch my work, it's just going to feel super repetitive and dull and I won't be able to get into it. And I get it, okay? Our brains love novelty. Mine certainly does. We love trying new systems and switching between apps and finding the new exciting idea. That's why it's so common to feel incredibly excited when we start a new habit or a new strategy and we're convinced this is the one because we have all of that dopamine firing with this new thing that we're discovering. But then also, on the other side, we quickly abandon it when it starts feeling routine. It's why we hop from planner to planner or, again, avoid batching tasks because, I don't want to have Tuesday look like the same thing all the time. So again, I get it. But here's the shift I invite you to consider. Constraint doesn't inherently squash novelty. In fact, I think when we can practice constraint in a way that feels good for you, it can actually create space for even deeper creativity. When our brain isn't constantly overwhelmed by needing to make decisions or consider new distractions or do additional research on the new rabbit hole, and we can instead focus on exploring new angles and new ideas within that one framework we've set, the options are endless. I mean, think about it like this. If you're writing newsletters on Tuesdays, the constraint is the activity. Okay, Tuesdays, I write my newsletter. But then within that, you can challenge yourself to come up with creative ways to share through story, through example, through different formats. So the framework gives you stability so you can have more energy to creatively play inside of that framework. All right. The fourth reason why so many of us ADHD brains tend to resist constraint and zeroing in on specific decisions or schedules is impulsivity and distractibility. Our brain is worried about new ideas popping in. So this is kind of building on reason number 3, but we're looking at it from a different angle. This is coming from a different concern that the brain might have. It's that thought that sounds something like, but what if I get a new idea and I'm supposed to be focused on this other thing? What if this new idea comes in? What am I going to do? And let's be honest, this happens all the time. You know, you're working on one task and suddenly this new idea comes in and it feels so exciting. You want to drop everything. You want to go chase that new idea. Or you avoid planning ahead because your brain thinks, but what if I change my mind later and this new idea comes in? Or maybe you found it almost impossible to follow through on a project without bouncing to something else halfway through. Again, this is such a common ADHD experience, and it makes sense because novelty is like a magnet for our brain. But the key shift I invite you to play with here is that constraints can actually help us channel our impulsivity into more structured creativity. So instead of seeing the constraint as a restriction, what if we think about constraint as a container for your idea? So for example, if you're focused on a new project and a fresh idea pops in, you might take time to jot it down in your idea notebook, your brilliant ideas list, a voice note. That way you know you've captured the thought without abandoning what you're doing. You put a container around it. If you're worried about changing your mind on a project or something. Maybe you try shorter, more flexible constraints. So rather than telling yourself, well, we're going to sit down and write newsletters all Tuesday, maybe it's something like, I'm going to write for 30 minutes and see how that goes. You're not locked into it forever. Instead, you're going to try that for a couple of weeks. Or if you're bouncing between projects, maybe you use batching or time blocking to give each idea its own dedicated space. So that way it feels less restrictive and more like an intentional choice. Don't worry, brain. We can make space for all of these different ideas. I promise you, we're going to have space for it, but we're going to decide where it fits so that we actually have the space to do it. Because the truth is, constraint doesn't have to mean you ignore all the impulses, all the new ideas. Instead, it means that we create some structure to hold them so that you can return to them with that full focus later. And that way you're not losing the spark of a great idea. You're just choosing when you're going to give it your full attention. And honestly, that's what gives the idea the best shot of actually coming to life. All right, the fifth and final reason why a lot of us ADHD brains resist constraint and scheduling is our all or nothing thinking and perfectionism comes in. So this resistance often sounds like, why even bother? I'm so terrible at this. I never stick with a schedule. I never stick to any kind of routine for the long term. And honestly, if I don't follow it every day, I just fall off the wagon. If I miss a day, what's the point in even trying at all? I have to do it perfectly. Otherwise, it doesn't count and I'm never consistent. I'm telling you, I see this all the time, especially regarding routines and schedules and any type of new system. For example, maybe you start a morning routine, but the day you skip, whatever day that is, your brain goes, well, that didn't work again. You failed. Why even bother? And we abandon the whole thing. Or maybe we avoid setting a schedule because we're convinced that we're just going to fall off track anyway. So what's the point? Why would I set a schedule if I know I'm not going to follow it? Or maybe it's a little more meta. Maybe your brain feels almost paralyzed thinking about choosing which area of your life to try practicing constraint, because the perfectionism sneaks in and goes, okay, we're going to just choose one. Oh my gosh, but what's the right one? What if I don't choose the right area? What if I don't choose a thing and it doesn't work? But here's the thing. Constraint isn't a rule that you can break. It's a tool that you use. Oh my gosh, that should be a catchphrase or something. Constraint isn't a rule. It's a tool. It is there to support you. It is not there to control you. And just like any tool, you can adjust it, you can adapt it, you can use it in any way that you want to, or you can swap it out for a different tool that might work better after you use it. For example, if you choose a constraint and you realize, ooh, this just feels way too rigid, that's a beautiful opportunity to tweak it. Okay? You can absolutely change that. If you had decided that you're going to have a really strict morning routine and it was down to every 15 or 30 minutes, you knew when you were switching and you realized, oof, that's way too rigid. Switch out the tool. Maybe you just have a menu of things you would like to do in the morning and you choose from the ones that feel best that day. Or if you quote unquote fall off track one day, remind your brain it doesn't mean it's over. What that means is you're human. Welcome. Welcome to the land of being human, where we don't do things perfectly all the time because we're not robots, right? Or if one approach that you try doesn't fit, remind yourself you're allowed to try a different one. In fact, that's literally the best approach to success. As all of my clients know, it's all about iteration. We try something, we see how it works, we adjust what we don't like, we keep what we like, and then we move forward and test it again. It's all of these small experiments that add up to create the approach that feels really good for you. So let's take a minute and reflect here. Which of these areas of resistance is most familiar to you? Okay, these 5 areas that we just talked about. We had the loss of freedom and flexibility, fear of that, fear of missing out, the need for novelty, the impulsivity, and our all or nothing perfectionist thinking. Okay, so think about those 5 areas. Notice which one or ones stand out most to you, and then use that, keep that in mind as we now shift into how we can gradually introduce a little more constraint for those of you who are seeking some more structural support. Now, again, I know I mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but I just feel like it's very important to re-stress here and reinforce here. We all have different preferred levels of structure. So if you are listening to this and you realize, I don't need more structure, I love the flexibility that I'm using right now, please stick with that. Don't force yourself to use more structure because you think you quote unquote should. All right? Only play with these areas where you might be feeling, ooh, I do think this could be useful potentially. Because again, a lot of us have that layered and complex relationship with constraint and schedules and routines. And if we can kind of unwind the tangles of all of those layers and smooth it out a little bit, we might find that having a little more structure can actually be a super supportive thing. So with that in mind, let's talk about how we can use constraint in a way that feels really supportive and not restrictive. Okay, so we know those different resistance points. We talked about the 5 areas. Now let's explore how we can actually make constraint work for you. And I have a step-by-step approach because y'all know I love a good action step. So step 1, we want to choose one area where you're going to practice applying the constraint. So start by picking just one small area of your life. We're just doing an experiment. Okay, instead of aiming for the big sweeping changes all our brains want to make, we're instead going to focus on a low pressure space where constraint might be helpful. I'll give you a couple of examples. Maybe it's limiting your to-do list once you get home from work. If you normally go to work, just things you'd be doing at home, or the things that you do on a weekend, or just the things at work. So not a full day, but limiting what's on your list to 1 to 3 key tasks. Those are the only things you focus on. So that way, instead of feeling pulled in a million different directions from the 347 things on all the different to-do lists and apps and things, you instead constrain the focus and hone in on what will really move the needle, the 1 to 3 things, and then decide on that either just at work or just when you're at home. So that way you're not trying to choose the 1 to 3 things for the whole day. That might feel like too much. You might also try batching your email or whatever other communication spaces you use, batching those check-ins. So traditionally, we hear people say deciding on your specific email check times. Maybe you check your email twice a day at 10 and at 4 instead of keeping your inbox open all day. If you are more in the Slack space, deciding or putting up away messages, letting people know when you're in deep work time versus when you're available for Slack communication or whatever. I am a big fan of Cal Newport's concept of office hours, where you set up specific times for yourself and you can let other people know this is when I'm available. So if you want to get a hold of me, I'll be answering emails or I'll be available on Slack or available on Voxer at that time, right? So having a way of constraining when you are in your communication spaces can free up that mental space and reduce the temptation to bounce between the things, because people know, oh, well, Paula has her office hours on Tuesdays between 4 and 5. That's when I can expect to hear from her or whatever. Okay. Now, I want to highlight an important mindset shift here. And I've mentioned it before, but again, I want to highlight it. Remind your brain that this is just an experiment. It's not permanent. It's not a commitment that you're married to for the rest of your life. Instead, it's an experiment, and we're going to test what feels good and then adjust it from there. So again, step 1 is to decide on one small area where you want to practice applying constraint first. That brings us to step 2, which is to make that area more dopamine friendly. I think it's so helpful for us to remember that constraint doesn't have to be boring. By making it fun and engaging, constraint can actually give us that dopamine boost by creating challenges or something fun to anticipate. I mean, think about Legos. I just got my niece, Ava, a whole bunch of Legos for her birthday. So I have Legos on my mind. And if you think about Legos, they're actually very constrained. They're these basic shapes. There's like a handful of them, not many. And they fit together in very specific ways. They just click on, right? But we can use this really constrained amount of blocks to build incredible things, okay? The constraint of the basic shape actually kicks our creativity into high gear. So how can we use the constraint to bring in a bit of delight, to bring in a bit more dopamine? Maybe you create a constraint lottery. You create a list of preset options for tasks, meals, workouts, whatever the area is that you're working on. And then when it's time to choose what you're going to do for dinner or for the workout, pick one at random. Maybe you write the options on slips of paper, put them in a hat, put them in a jar, pull one out. It adds this kind of surprise and delight while keeping you within the chosen limits that you decided ahead of time. Or maybe you use the only 3 rule, okay? When we're faced with too many options, maybe we narrow it down to 3. For example, I'll choose from these 3 restaurants today, or I'll pick from these 3 writing prompts for my newsletter. When we have a smaller number of options, fewer options, it keeps it so much simpler, but it still gives your brain the satisfaction of having a choice, right? That idea of a menu of options. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 5, it doesn't matter. But having a fewer amount of options still gives your brain the flexibility of choice, but also within a container that feels good. Now, why does this work? Well, again, ADHD brains, we love novelty. We love as well having a clear endpoint. And so constraint can help remove the brain's tendency to spin in overwhelm about all the endless decisions, while also giving you that little spark of variety and of choice. So to help really practice this one, if your brain, again, really resists the idea, you might remind yourself, hey, brain, when we bring in constraint here, it actually makes decision-making easier and even more engaging because we're creating opportunities for fun, for dopamine. Yes, please. We can always use a little more of that. When we can bring in the opportunity for choice or for anticipation of what are we going to do today? What am I pulling out of the jar? We can help release some of that dopamine and bring in a bit more delight. So that's step 2. We're bringing in the dopamine. And then we get to step 3, which is to reframe the task or the project or whatever it is as a fun challenge. So you might treat constraint like a game. Instead of thinking, oh, I have to stick to this stupid routine. It's always this way. It's so boring. You might ask yourself, how can I get creative within this time limit? So for example, maybe you do a working challenge. So you set a 30-minute or a 25-minute sprint to get some work done. And you think to yourself, okay, how much could I get done within this time window? And you set your little timer. I'll show you the one I love. It's this one here. It's very big because I'm super time blind and I need it right in front of me. For those of you listening to the podcast, I'm showing this on YouTube right now. But I just turn the thing and it's going. And I know, I want to get all my emails answered within this 25-minute block. And off we go. Okay. So instead of trying to focus on getting everything perfect or get everything done or whatever, we might instead focus on how quickly can I get through the list? Or maybe it's meal prep constraint. Maybe next time you're looking at the fridge and you're like, oh, there's nothing to eat. I don't know what to do. This is so much. Maybe you create a challenge and you go, okay, what meal could I come up with using only what I have in the fridge and the pantry? And you maybe bring in ChatGPT and you say, here are the things I have. What can I make in 15 minutes or less? Both of these options, they work with the ADHD brain, again, because we thrive on novelty and problem solving. And when constraint becomes that puzzle to solve, we're engaging that part of the brain that loves a challenge. I have 25 minutes. How much can I get done? I have these things in the refrigerator. What could I possibly make? So in this situation, you might remind your brain, you know what? Constraint can actually be more of a creative playground for the brain. This is really an opportunity to explore and find some unexpected solutions. And then we get to step 4, which is, as always, adjust as needed. Constraint is not one size fits all. It's a tool that works best when it's customized to fit your brain and your needs. So again, if constraint feels too tight, that's not a failure. You're not doing it wrong. It's just information. The point is that we want to support your brain with the proper level of structural support. It's not to create stress or to make you beat yourself up. Okay? So a few ways to help you keep your constraints flexible and adaptable is to test and tweak them. Think of every constraint as this small experiment. If you commit to that 30-minute work sprint, but you lose focus at 20 minutes, great data. Next time, maybe you try a 22-minute sprint instead. Or maybe you think in seasons. I'm thinking back to our episode last week, episode 300, where we talked about Picasso. Picasso moved through his creative phases, like his blue period. And we can think of it in the same way. Your constraints can shift over time. What works in a busy season might not work during slower periods. So you might play with thinking of your constraints in seasons, not as these rigid rules that you're stuck with forever. Constraint works best when it feels supportive, not suffocating. So when you're building these routines or these schedules or these plans, if they feel heavy, if they feel like you're trapped, if you feel like you have no flexibility there, adjust it. Make it smaller, loosen up the structure, approach it from a different angle, bring in a bit more flexibility. Remind your brain, constraint is a flexible tool and it evolves with you. So the practice is finding that sweet spot where you feel supported while also having the space for creativity and growth. So here's my challenge for you this week. I invite you to pick one small way where you can play with constraint in your life. Again, we're not overhauling your entire schedule. We're not locking you into some rigid system for all of eternity. It's about trying one low pressure experiment. Maybe it is limiting your to-do list to 1 to 3 things at work, or choosing just one theme to focus on in your newsletter for the week, or committing to batch cook 3 meals using only what's in your fridge. Okay? After you try that constraint, notice the resistance that comes up and then practice reframing it if you need to. And remind your brain, this is just an experiment. It's not a rule. I can adjust it if it stops working. Constraint isn't about doing less. It's about doing what matters more, even more effectively. Because the truth is, constraint is not here to hold us back. It can point us in the right direction. It gives us a framework to focus and create and finish the things that we start. And then after that week that you test it out, notice what works, what feels easier, what felt harder, what do you want to tweak? That's how constraint works for ADHD brains. Through flexibility, through curiosity, through play, allow yourself to experiment, see what works, see what doesn't, and notice how your ideal level of constraint can be so supportive for your brain and your goals. All right, my friends, that's going to do it for us this week. And if you are ready to take these concepts and apply them to your life, if you're ready to learn how to support your ADHD in a way that works best for you, I invite you to check out today's show notes where you can learn more about how we can work together, both in my small group coaching program, We're Busy Being Awesome, and in one-on-one coaching. Also, do you want to learn my simple step-by-step approach to locking in a routine and making it stick? If so, be sure to check out my free course. It's called the ADHD Routine Revamp. You can grab it now through the link in the show notes or head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/routine to sign up. Until next time, keep being awesome. I'll talk with you soon.